Greetings one and all. I've had a few people sending emails asking why I've not done any shows lately, and I've been taking a break, I suppose. Been out and about and doing various projects and such like, and I'll be revealing them later on in the year. But I wanted to do something about what Maurice Nicoll's written, and I thought what I'd do is actually read a piece of his from Psychological Commentaries, Book 4 first, and then perhaps discuss it afterwards. So this is Maurice Nicoll from Amwell on the 25th of August 1951, and it's called On Testing the Work in Oneself. Self-justifying and buffers prevent us from seeing contradictions in ourselves. To bear the burden of oneself is to be aware of these contradictions almost continually, so that the fire does not go out and the work becomes cold. This is the small flame lit under the retort of shifting powders. You cannot get rid of the burden of yourself save by falling asleep. Awakening is painful, but it takes a long time to understand this essential meaning of the work. It is not only that we have to bear the unpleasant manifestations of others, we have to bear the unpleasant manifestations of ourselves. If we justify everything we do, we bring about a state of non-work in ourselves. With self-justifying, and by the silent and almost instantaneous action of buffers, there is no work. There cannot be, save in imagination. To imagine we are working is to deceive ourselves. To test our work is another matter. If we try to test our work, our consciousness moves away from imagination, self-justifying, and the action of buffers which belong to the outer man. What can it mean to test one's work? It means to observe one's work in the light of what the work teaches, to let, as it were, the work itself judge one's own work on oneself and not another person. This testing of the genuineness of one's work, for example, are you really struggling with imagination? This assaying of what is gold and what is spurious, this separating of the fine from the coarse, sets up an inner division. You can call it the struggle between yes and no, if it helps you. Its action is like a to and fro motion in any case, and so like yes I will and no I will not. Or if you prefer, you can see it under another work term, as a heat, a friction set up in oneself. This, as was said, is the heat under the retort which contains the metallic powders which are continually being shifted aimlessly about by every tap of life, because they are not fused into one thing, into a unity. Now this heat under the retort, drawn as a lighted candle in the Liber Mutus, must be kept going and not allowed to cease for long, as it does especially when the external things of life swamp us, and the consciousness of the work is lost, and we fall asleep. I said you must bear this unpleasant manifestations of yourself. This is the point. You must, for example, see the contradictions in yourself. This keeps you awake. One side of you will pretend you have good reasons for what you did. Another side knows you were wrong. This is the friction. To say openly you were wrong is not what I mean. This sort of confession is insincere, although much practiced. It gets rid of attention, and I fancy often reinforces the false personality in its pictures. It is better for you to be caught in the act and notice how you then twist and turn. To be accused of something you have not done is still better, because it can produce strong friction if used aright. Ordinarily, it simply creates waterspouts of indignation and torrents of self-pity and recrimination. That is why the control of negative emotions is so indispensable in esoteric work. Negative emotions put out the candle and flood the experiment. They have nothing to do with that dry heat that should be under the retort. We enjoy negative emotions. We pretend they are painful, but the quality of pain that this heat of which we are speaking gives us is different. Eventually, when we lapse into negative states, we may feel pain of the same quality as that produced in us by this heat, and then they act as warnings. Let us return to the idea of testing the work. I'm going to take the first 4 verses of Galatians chapter 6. The first verse is as follows. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. The centre of gravity is that when reproving someone, it is necessary to observe oneself and not merely see something wrong in another. You will agree that pointing out faults in others is a common and easy occupation. It is mechanical and so easy. As you know, members of groups in the work must not do this unless asked by their victim. When we point out faults in others, we apparently expect them to change. Of course, they cannot change any more than we can. No. What we have to do is bear the unpleasant manifestations in others, which in the next verse is put as bearing the burden of other people, a difficult thing, but translated as bearing one another's burdens, an easy thing. Verse 2 in the Authorized and Revised versions is, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. But Monsignor Knox, in his recent translation of the New Testament, renders the verse, bear the burden of one another's failings, then you will be fulfilling the law of Christ. In a footnote, he points out that the more usual interpretation of the passage, which understands the burdens of one another to mean the misfortunes of others, which we are to bear by our sympathy, does not agree well with the context which goes before or with that which follows. He refers to the definition of the law of Christ in Matthew, chapter 6, verse 14, and chapter 28, verse 35, as forgiveness of others. Bearing the burden of another's failings will produce some heat. Yes, but something more is necessary. Eventually, you must bear the burden of your own failings and not be negative. We are complacent about ourselves, not seeing our contradictions. But it is useless to have a good opinion of oneself. It makes the work of no account. So verse 3 says, for if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Then in verse 4 we are told that we must test the work on ourselves. Are we genuinely working? Quote, let each man test his own work, and then he will be able to take the measure of his own worth instead of another's. End quote. Yes, but then he will also have to bear the burden of his own failings, the burden of himself instead of finding fault with others. But he will then find that it is less difficult to bear the burden of other people's manifestations, seeing his own. So the 5th verse completes this fragment of teaching by saying, each of us then will have his own load to carry. Then there is an additional note by Maurice Nicoll. The point of this paper is that it makes use of one illustration given by Paul of what work on oneself means, so that a certain inner heat or pain is set up which can eventually transform us. But as long as justifying ourselves, seeing faults in others only, and being protected by buffers continue, so that we do not see contradictions in ourselves, this heat or friction is not set up. We avoid it. Paul explains the stages. Verse 1. In finding fault, observe yourself also. Verse 2. Understand that you must bear the burden of other people. That means, as the work says, we must bear the unpleasant manifestations of others. Verse 4. But you must truly test the qualities of the work on yourself. Verse 5. And then you must bear the burden of yourself. That is, not justify or buffer things off, but bear it, and not become negative or pitiful. All this will give the necessary heat to melt something in you. And that's the end of the paper by Maurice Nicoll. And I was finding this very interesting because I've been talking to people in the Gurdjieff work, or people that have been coming to the Gurdjieff paperworks, books and such like recently, who have been struggling with this kind of thing, bearing the burden of others. You know, I myself often, oh God, I struggle with a lot of people. You know, and these are people that are not awake or waking up. These are people that are definitely asleep. And we have to not necessarily take pity on them, but try to understand where they are coming from. But they also sometimes make me fall into old patterns, and I stop doing the work and instead fall back into old mechanical ways. And then I try and justify myself later for what I'm doing. But as he says here, it's even though you might be thinking about it later after you've done whatever it is you've done, you know, lost control of your negative emotions or something, thinking about it later, okay, is quite good consideration, but it's trying to notice it when it happens, trying to stop the negative reactions to things when they're happening. Taking a moment to realize what's going on around you. It's like we're sort of got to take ourselves out of the time and the situation, observe what's going on, and recalibrate so we don't fall back into old patterns, but recalibrate and do the work instead. Give work action, put work action into play. I often fall back asleep and the work is lost. Usually in my everyday life, it is very difficult to keep the work in you at all times. I was actually talking to someone the other day who was saying, no, we should only do spiritual things at certain moments, and the rest of the day we do go around mechanically. And we ended up having quite a debate about it, whereas I think we should be trying to put the spiritual into everything that we do. But it's difficult, isn't it? You know, if we could be filled by the Holy Spirit, then everything we touch, see, do, whatever will be also then filled by that Holy Spirit. But most of the time we are walking about asleep and working in a mechanical way. But it's taking on the burdens of others can be quite difficult. Sometimes we're very frustrated by how someone's acting towards us or to others. That's a lot of the things that I struggle with when I'm out and about in my everyday life, seeing how other people are acting towards or reacting towards people that are, you know, people fighting on the streets, or mums struggling with their children who are either misbehaving or crying or such like, you know. And I find that quite difficult to bear, and all I can do actually is give a little prayer for them and ask Christ to come down and perhaps help them. But I do see how seeing that kind of thing creates something in me, which is kind of like a friction. It can bring me down quite a lot, especially with children who are devastated with whatever's coming on or screaming uncontrollably. I find that very hard to cope with outside. But then how do I can't go and interfere with that mother and that child. That's their business. But I can, like I say, all I can do is say a prayer and ask for Christ to interfere. And Maurice Nicoll was talking here that Monsignor Knox was talking about how we have to bear sympathy for people. I try to be sympathetic with people, but at the same time, sometimes I can see that what's created that situation that they want sympathy for could be resolved in another way if they weren't so mechanical. But it's difficult, as I'm sure many of you know, to discuss these kinds of, well, the work system with people that are very mechanical, which is why I thought this was a very important paper to put out there on my channel. Like I say, I haven't done a few videos for a while. But the last bit at the end of this paper, where Paul explains the various stages and Maurice Nicoll is paraphrasing them, are very important. You know, when we find fault in others, we then have to observe ourselves and probably find that we can have them same faults as well. We shouldn't be judging anyone, which again is something I've noticed is happening a lot amongst people lately. Though this is it's a strange year again, as all the last few years have been. People seem to be ready to, everything's very prickly, I think. People seem to be ready to have an argument a lot, or, oh no, I'm not going to go down that path, but we need to try and understand why everything seems so fractious. And verse 2, understand that you must bear the burden of other people. You know, we do have to bear the unpleasant manifestations of others. And we have to transform them in us so that we are not letting them affect us, but stand outside of them. We observe, but we do not get attached. And then we also have to test the qualities of the work on ourselves. Now that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because as I was just saying, I sometimes forget to be in the work and get caught up in mechanicalness. So how do we test these qualities of the work on ourselves? Definitely being aware of when we're becoming negative is very important. And trying not to be too complacent about things, perhaps. But sometimes we do ignore our own contradictions. And as Maurice Nicoll was saying earlier, many people enjoy negative emotions. Gurdjieff says this. People like their suffering. But when we're trying to transform them, I find it interesting that he uses the word heat. Rudolf Steiner actually uses the word warmth. We're creating a divine heat or warmth within us when we are working, which is a very different energy. And an even stronger energy is true forgiveness. And we've talked, like Maurice Nicoll talks about forgiveness in this being sincere. And sincere forgiveness is a very powerful energy to create. But I've done a show about forgiveness before, and I've talked about how I used to just forgive people so I could move on. But maybe, you know, later on in life, that little, whatever it was that I had to forgive them would raise its ugly head again, because I realized I had not truly forgiven. True forgiveness is a very powerful thing and needs a lot of work to get to. But once it's done, it's amazing, the release it brings. And like I say, a strange energy that's very comforting. So the work has to also point out that we cannot change others, which is why we're trying to bear the unpleasant manifestations of others. But I do believe that if we can do the work in front of them without saying, look, I'm doing Gurdjieff work, but, you know, just try to be, people notice and then they want to become like that. It's like a ripple goes out and people want to then realise they can change. I noticed myself in my own family that because I didn't see them for a long time, and when I came back, and I was quite different because obviously I'd been working on myself, I was dealing with a lot of things, so I did also fall back into old patterns with them now and then. But I could see how that change that they observed began to make a change in them and how they reacted towards me. Not old patterns were coming up. But justification, that's something else that comes up in this paper, and I realised I used to try and justify many things that I'd done that were wrong. I actually had an example of that just this weekend where I was finding someone was making me very irritable. I never lost it with them, but I could feel in myself, all my muscles were tensing, my mouth was getting all rigid and stern because they were annoying me, and I had to work upon myself of relax, just try and understand why they were annoying me, Obviously, I don't want to go into the personal details, but I'm sure you can perhaps put this to your own situations with people. But then I was trying to justify it later, when really, deep down, I just wasn't working properly in the work. I was falling back again into old patterns, and I was not bearing the burden of that other person's burdens, and why that person was irritating me. I have to, as Maurice Nicoll says at the end in the last paragraph, that is, not justify or buffer things off, but bear it, not become negative or pitiful. The work is hard work, but at the same time, it has wonderful results, and it is worth it when we do it, which is what it's all about, the being and the doing of the work. So thank you everybody for listening to this. My books are still available. I still haven't put it up on the website, Exercising Witches, but that's my latest one, which can be found on Amazon, which is all about forgiveness. But it is a fiction story, all about exercising demons through the power of forgiveness. So please, if you want to support me, since I no longer have a monetized YouTube channel, because I was very naughty and put Vladimir Solovyev's Antichrist book up, and YouTube did not like it. So if you want to support me, please buy my books. Otherwise, till next time, peace and out.